This episode is brought to you by Anchor. If you're anything like me and you love podcasts and you want to get started with your own, Anchor is absolutely the best place to do it. Anchor is a free podcast creation tool that allows you to record and edit your own podcast right from your phone or your computer. And Anchor distributes the podcast as well, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money right away from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It is everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Now, let's seize the day. Hey everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Carpe podcast. I'm thrilled to bring you a conversation that I had with Caleb Ontiveros. Caleb is the founder of Stoa Meditation. Stoa is a meditation app that allows you to meditate on Stoic principles in a mindful way. I think it is the single best tool out there right now for cultivating a Stoic mindset. So if you haven't yet, I highly recommend you go and check it out. In addition to talking about his journey with Stoa, how he got started and where it's going, we talk a little bit about how Caleb uses Stoa on a day-to-day basis, some of his favorite Stoics, both contemporary and in the ancient world, and we talk about some of the things he does to make his days more effective and productive. I think this was an awesome conversation. I know you all are going to get a lot of value out of it. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Caleb Ontiveros. Alrighty, Caleb, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Liam.
So, Caleb, for the audience, would you mind giving us a little overview of your background and kind of how you got started down the path of Stoicism?
Absolutely. So I studied philosophy and encountered the Stoics in a course on ancient philosophy, and they didn't hit me. I didn't think it was that important first. I remember reading Epictetus's handbook. It didn't strike me quite the way it did later. And then while I was in graduate school, I took some time on my own to read through Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And it was then that I realized that Stoicism was an exceptionally insightful and useful philosophy. I appreciated Marcus's urgency, how serious he took life, and some of the insights around psychology were really deep. So I went back and read through Epictetus, read Seneca's letters, and found them to be especially valuable, and really been a life philosophy that I've adopted since then.
So when you say you like how Marcus took life so seriously, what do you mean kind of by that? What about his serious approach toward life really resonated with you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think one thing that comes to mind here is that the Stoics will often talk about death in a way that other philosophies do not make as central. And there's a sense in which that can make the philosophy seem a little bit morbid at a first pass. But to me, that is embracing the reality that we do die, and that's something that we need to think about, something we need to position our lives in respect to. And that is what I'm getting at when I say that the Stoic philosophy was serious. Is you can have other philosophies that avoid that question, that sort of just push it off until it's too late. But for the Stoics, that is something that people are aware of and should shape how one acts. So, for instance, Marcus Aurelius has a line that says, do not act as if you'll live for 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While it is within your power, be good. And it's that urgency around, realizing that you are going to die, and it would be good to have your house in order before that happens. Be good. That really stuck out to me.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the aspects of Stoicism that it seems like a lot of people are drawn to, and definitely appreciate your perspective on that. So obviously, philosophy student getting interested in the Stoics by, reading some of the original material. How did you then take that from this philosophy that you enjoyed to I need to create this tool that is super tactical and practical that will help people really put this philosophy into practice every day.
Right. So I created Stoa, which is a mobile app which you can use to do Stoic meditations and listen to conversations with experts like Massimo Pigliucci on Stoicism, and a few others. And the inspiration for that was that I've meditated since I was in high school, um, and found a lot of value in a number of different meditation courses and meditation apps, but wanted to have something that included the Stoic philosophy into the meditation practice because I think it adds a very useful frame. A lot of meditation apps are either explicitly Buddhist or implicitly have some Western version of Buddhism behind them, which I think is quite good. Buddhism has a number of very important insights, but the Stoic philosophy, I think, maybe fits a little bit more with my personality, and there's an emphasis on reason and rationality that I think can go quite well with the meditation practice.
So how did you get started kind of with your meditation practice? What originally drew you to that?
Yeah, so I think there was just a general interest in the nature of the mind, and meditation is one way to understand what's going on, using introspection to pay very fine attention to your breath, different sensations in the body. And I think one insight that you get reasonably quickly as you meditate is this understanding that you are not your thoughts, and there's a separation between your initial impressions about the world and then how you actually judge the world. And this insight is also something that is, as you know, shared in Stoic philosophy. This idea that, the things are not, say, painful in themselves, but rather it's our opinion of those things. And the sensation and the initial impression are distinct from the judgment we make about them. And that sort of insight you can get at an intuitive sense with meditation, and I found that to be exceptionally useful. But the general reason to begin meditating was an interest in, like potentially this is a tool that people have used to get at the nature of the mind, and it seems like something worth trying.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's definitely that sort of common thread of understanding that we're not our thoughts and we don't have to get overly involved in them is a really interesting way that a lot of people have brought meditation and stoicism, the kind of modern meditation mindfulness craze together. So obviously you've had to interact with a lot of the Stoics to build out the content for your app. Would you say that Marcus was kind of the one that resonated with you the most? I know you said you read Meditations and that really hit you, or kind of what different insights have you really resonated with from the different Stoics? Which Stoic do you resonate with the most? Kind of how have you interacted with the different Stoic authors?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like that question a lot. I often like to ask other people, who are Stoics, this question. So I'm glad you asked it. For me, yeah, Marcus, I think, was probably the one that, if I had to choose one Stoic to read for the rest of my life, it would probably be Marcus, or at least his Meditations. Potentially just for historical reasons. I happened to read him at the time, where it's very, very impactful to me. But so a specific thing that I like about Marcus Aurelius that you do not see in other Stoic philosophers is this let's see, you can call it maybe more of a, it's almost spiritual, but a little bit more of an emphasis on the cosmos and how things are impermanent and how things are ever changing. You get this to some extent, lines on this in Seneca and Epictetus, but it's the um, emphasis on how things will come and go, how nothing is permanent is quite uh, strong in Marcus Aurelius. Probably gets it from some fragments from Heraclitus. And yeah, so I think that there are a number of different passages that stand out to me there on the Aurelius side. On Seneca, I think Seneca is a very good psychologist about the nature of humans. So we'll just go over a number of different cases and problems in his letters, and I think it's like very well attuned to how people work. And part of this influences his view on the nature of emotions and feelings in a way that makes him a little bit more human than, say, Epictetus or at times Marcus Aurelius. One of my favorite lines from Seneca is the line that goes something to the effect of, "You may grieve, but do not wail," or "You may weep, but do not wail," which is this idea that there are natural emotional responses, or potentially he might call these natural feelings that one can have in response to events. And what one wants to do is not make false judgments, in his case, wailing. But nonetheless, he recognizes that we do have natural responses to particular events, which is something that sometimes you might be reading Epictetus and get the sense that no, you should be, not even have the feeling of grief. So I think that's a useful aspect of Seneca. And then on the Epictetus side, I see Epictetus as stern, sort of like a coach. He's sort of like the coach who's telling you, you ought to meet these exceptionally high standards, and he has a singular focus on virtue, following the Stoic disciplines, while ignoring everything else that might distract an ordinary human. And that kind of attitude can be quite useful at times. Yeah, so I think that was a long-winded answer at the three main Stoics and what I find useful about them.
No, I loved that answer, and I think it's really interesting. It seems like generally the answers when you ask people that question now is that they find Marcus to be really exceptional and relatable. Seneca, a lot of people find a lot of value in Seneca. A lot of people struggle with Epictetus, and I think it's really kind of interesting that that's such a common thread. But it definitely does speak to the very. I like the way you put it as kind of a coach, holding the reader to those very high Stoic standards. That almost seem unreachable at times. But so obviously, in terms of creating this awesome tool Stoa that has all these great Stoic meditations, how do you use your own app? How do you help yourself practice Stoicism on a day-to-day basis? What is do you have specific ones that you listen to pretty regularly, or how do you use your own tool?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'd say in the beginning, I would loop through the meditation sequences, starting with, of course, some of the introductory meditations, and then the initial meditations that we added after that, moving to the 3 weeks on Stoicism, and go through that and then repeat that cycle. Right now, what I'm doing is using a timer to meditate without guidance, and then a few days in a week, I'll maybe listen to one of the view from above exercises, because that is an exercise I find especially useful. And I think it also gets back to this idea of, Marcus Aurelius focusing on how things are impermanent and taking this higher view of the world. And seeing one's life in the much wider span of time and space than we are used to. So what I will do is, at some point in the morning, spend time, 5 or 10 minutes, either setting a timer, going through that exercise of sitting, meditating. I can go through what that looks like in a little bit more detail, but just to lay out the steps first, I'll do you either use a timer or use the view from above meditation. And that's primarily how I'll use the app. On occasion, I will also take notes and journal if that feels appropriate. I think the Stoics journal is there for when people, might feel inspired to note something, but it's by no means a full journaling system, though a few people have used it that way. So another common Stoic practice that I'll do is I have a journaling routine where I will go over what went well, what I'd like to improve on, what I've learned through the day, and then just take any notes on what I'd like to do for the following day. And I'll do that in the evening, and that'll be an evening reflection, which I will use Stoa for or use a different journaling tool for.
So with your journal, do you kind of do it a free format? Do you have, you obviously will use your tool, but do you just kind of do freehand writing based on prompts, or do you have, any sort of note system or anything like that?
Yeah, so what I do is pretty structured. I will have 4 sections. One about what went well, where I think I exemplified virtue, or if there's something I think that, I did particularly well in that is worth noting. And then also have a section for where things could have gone better, a section for what I learned, and then a section for the following day. And so that's pretty structured. I think it's also useful to, on occasion, look at a quote, but that mostly serves as, having some sort of inspirational or motivational power, as opposed to that influencing what I end up writing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely love to look to a good Stoic quote for inspiration to help me journal more effectively as well. So obviously there are a lot of people who are rediscovering Stoicism. Many of them through your tool. Who are some of the modern Stoic authors or thinkers that you really look to for inspiration, in addition to Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus? Who are some people who are your contemporaries that you admire in this field?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I think Donald Robertson has done some excellent work linking contemporary cognitive behavioral therapy and Stoicism together. For example, linking together Marcus Aurelius's exercise, that's sometimes called his exercise of analysis, sometimes called his exercise of decomposition, where he will say focus on a given thing, like the power of a royal tunic, and then break it down into its parts. Say this is a sheep's wool dyed in the blood of a shellfish. And this practice, I think Pierre Hadot calls it, focusing on objective representation, also fits in well with some contemporary cognitive behavioral practices, where the focus is on achieving what's called cognitive distance from some of our more troublesome thoughts. And Donald Robertson has done an excellent job mapping out them the ways in which contemporary cognitive behavioral therapy has been influenced by Stoic thoughts, and then also laying out some of the useful exercises that people can do. So I'd highly recommend his work. And then in terms of other work by contemporary Stoics, I'm also quite a big fan of Ward Farnsworth's book, The Practicing Stoic, which does a good job taxonomizing the different writings by Stoic authors into particular themes, and I think can provide a useful model for people to do it by themselves. This main idea that you don't want the Stoics to do all your thinking for you. Instead, think about what sorts of things you find valuable, and then match different lines that you find were inspirational, served as inspiration or motivation for those values that you have. And think about how you want, what role you want emotion to play in your life, what role you want virtue to play in your life, and that practice is quite useful. So, and I think that book is an excellent model of that, in addition to being a pretty good introduction to Stoicism. There is quite a lot of contemporary work on Stoicism, of course, and I think Massimo Pigliucci is also worth mentioning here. I think that though he's not a traditional Stoic, I think a lot of people can find value out of reading Nassim Taleb. I think his book Anti-Fragile is pretty good, at least the first 50 pages or so, and is worth reading. And if you like the style, continue reading. If you don't, stop.
Yeah, I definitely have Anti-Fragile on my reading list. I've heard that recommended time and time again, so I better bump that up the list, because sounds like that's a must read sooner than later, especially in these times we're in now. So that's your point there about finding value from different things is a great segue into my next question, which is a lot of people have started to look to Stoicism as kind of a life hack, and maybe not so much as an overall philosophy. And so they're taking the aspects that, say can help them reduce anxiety, but they're maybe omitting some of the obligations on virtue in their focus and in their practice. Would you say that generally you kind of need to take the whole package to, weave it all together and have that holistic approach? Or do you think that the kind of taking things separately can be equally as effective depending on what people are looking for?
Yeah, I think on the margin, it would be better if people took more rather than less Stoicism on board. And just to clarify what I mean by that is, you can think of Stoicism as a life philosophy having, as you said, both views about practical techniques and exercises about how to live, but also views about what is valuable in a life and what is worth doing. And as you say, sometimes people maybe take a particular technique, like say, I want to do voluntary discomfort for a week, take cold showers, what have you. Maybe longer. But don't say read about the importance of virtues to Stoic thoughts. And I think it would be better for more people to think about, what do they think is ultimately good in life? What are they pursuing? Otherwise, they might find themselves in a case where years go down, years happen, and down the line they look back and we wonder what all the effort was for. And if you're not reflective about what sorts of goods you're pursuing in a life, you'll end up pursuing, what people have done traditionally, or, you'll be you're basically outsourcing that kind of thinking to others, which, depending on where you are, it might be a good thing or a bad thing. It's probably going to be suboptimal. So so in general, I think the short answer is it's good to think about the virtues and also think about that both by reading the ancient philosophers, some modern philosophers, but also doing quite a lot of work on your own about what you think is most valuable and going through different exercises there and getting more clarity on what that looks like. So, and just to push on some Stoic thought here a little bit, is there's this idea of the four cardinal virtues in Stoicism, which isn't especially unique to Stoicism. It's mostly a view about the cardinal virtues in ancient Greece and Rome. And one thing you can do is spend time asking yourself, what does justice, courage, and self-control look like for me? And think about how to structure your life in more concrete detail than some of these vague ideas about virtue. Not to say that they're bad, but what justice can look like in a life depends on the person and depends on, to some extent, some of your own personal values.
Well, while we're on the topic of virtue, I want to touch a little bit on the topic of the virtue of moderation, and especially as it relates to tech, because obviously that's something that has become a great source of anxiety for people, and the fact that we are constantly connected to our devices. How do you kind of make time for some space from tech in your life, or how do you use stoicism as a tool to help you have a healthier relationship with technology and with social media and with the information overload that we're constantly feeling?
Sure. So let's see. Before I do that, I did just realize that I neglected to mention wisdom in the list of the four cardinal virtues, which is quite important. Don't forget wisdom. I might question the premise a little bit there. Is it really true that people are facing information overload? I'm not so sure. Maybe that's just something people say a lot. Like, I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't. Maybe you think that's true, but it's not obviously true for me that I'm facing an information overload. And I know that there's a decent amount of work looking at the influence of people's happiness on, or rather, the influence of social media on people's happiness. And the conclusions are pretty mixed. That said, there are good and bad ways to use social media, and not just social media, but also the news. I think this probably ties in back to what I said earlier about doing the work to be reflective and thinking about what sorts of values you want to have in a life. Well, you can do the same sorts of work when it comes to using social media. The default social media user probably does not pursue goods that would be, more valuable than, say, reading a good book or listening to excellent music. So I think in some ways you don't want to become the default social media user, and to do that, you might step back and ask, what sorts of things are valuable in social media if you're going to use it, or what sorts of things are valuable when it comes to regularly consuming the news. And just to list off a few things, I think that for social media first. It can be an excellent tool for connecting you with different niches. So there's a pretty active social media scene for Stoics. You likely have other interests. I have other interests where I can find people from across the world who will introduce me to things I wouldn't have read otherwise. And that's quite useful. And occasionally, social media can also be useful for getting news about, say, your local area or something of that sort. And then to say a bit about the news, yeah, I think maybe I won't give too much recommendation here, but there's certainly a pattern people can have where they focus on what is newsworthy, and the things that are newsworthy for a reason, mostly because they get people excited, typically by playing on negative emotions. And this can be a good way to practice stoicism, either by not interacting with those kinds of events, or at least not letting those sorts of events shape your model of the world as much as they would if you weren't being reflective about it.
Well, I definitely appreciate the perspective there, and especially, I think that that information overload point is, I think it definitely can be an intentional choice to expose ourselves to information overload, or to uh, avoid it, and to know properly what to tune out. Um, so you've had a lot of conversations with people who are involved in Stoicism now, or um, people who do things that kind of fit with the philosophy of Stoicism. Um, what not to make you pick a favorite guest or anything like that, but what are some of the points? Who are some of the guests that you've had on your conversations on Stoa that you've really learned something significant from, or what things have kind of stuck out to you, pardon me, in these conversations with all of these different folks?
Yeah, so I think that might have a little bit of a recency bias here, but two people who I spoke with recently who I think are both pretty thoughtful about Stoicism are Scott Aiken and William Stevens. So I spoke to the philosopher Scott Aiken about Epictetus. And one thing that I liked and thought was quite useful about that conversation is that Scott likes to position things sort of as paradoxes. And for example, you have sort of a pseudo paradox about, or an apparent paradox about how, Stoics say you should become sage-like, but it's pretty unclear whether you can, in fact, actually become a sage. And what are you supposed to make of that? And I think it's a pretty common pattern in his thought. And that can be a good way to think through different philosophical problems, is sort of positioning them as apparent paradoxes like that. On William Stevens' side, one thing that I learned from him quite a lot is just how much Heraclitus influenced Marcus Aurelius' thoughts, and that's something I had underrated, personally. And then I already mentioned Donald Robertson, but I think his conversation is a good one if you want. The conversation I had with him was a good one if you want to get a sense of how cognitive behavioral therapy was influenced by Stoicism and how he thinks about that. Relatedly, Tim LeBon also part of the Modern Stoic team, does work analyzing what sorts of Stoic exercises are useful to people, and whether there is solid evidence around how Stoicism can improve people's lives or their self-reports about their lives. I suppose I don't want to just start listing off too many guests, but I would say one other uh, conversation that I enjoyed quite a lot was my conversation with Chris Gill. And one point that Chris made is around the points of indifference. So just a step back. Um, in Stoicism, you have this idea that what is ultimately good is virtue. And there are other things in life that can be good, like pleasure, wealth. Virtue is what is ultimately good, and these other things, these things that are external, are called indifference. And then there are two different ways of explaining what the relationship is between indifference and virtue. One way that's pretty common is that to say that virtue is what is ultimately good is to say that it is um, going to win in a say a battle whenever you're making a trade-off between an indifference and virtue. The fancy way to say this is that virtue is lexically prior to the indifference. The value of virtue is always higher whenever you're making a trade-off between a virtue and an indifference. Another way to explain this is in terms of it's not that you're thinking about virtues and indifference as a trade-off, but what makes virtue good is whether you what makes an indifferent good is whether you use it in a virtuous way. And it's this latter point that Chris Gill made that I thought was quite useful, because often you get the first explanation, but the second explanation points out that actually the dichotomy can be a false one in a lot of our decisions. And what matters is acting virtuously, and you can act well by using wealth in a particular way, by experiencing pleasure in a particular way. And it's not a matter of making trade-offs, but a matter of acting virtuously. So that was a long answer of a handful of people. I suppose just to recap some of the conversations that came first to mind. Of course, I'd recommend all of them were the conversations with Scott Aiken, one on Epictetus with him, William Stevens on Marcus Aurelius, Donald Robertson on therapy, as well as Tim LeBon. And then finally, Chris Gill, who has done some excellent work bringing Stoicism back to contemporary philosophy.
Awesome. Well, I'm, have incredibly enjoyed a lot of the conversations that you've had. They've been of great value to me, and I've really enjoyed hearing a lot of these perspectives. So thank you very much for putting a lot of these together. Before we wrap up here today, just a quick couple last questions. So what does kind of your daily routine look like, including your time with Stoa? How do you manage kind of the flow of your day on a typical day?
Yeah, so I'd like to spend the beginning of the day usually jumping into whatever I wanted to whatever is on the top of my to-do list. Whether that is, say, writing content or programming. At which point, I think actually, let me step back a little bit. I think a better way to answer this question would be, I think some of the most important things I do with structuring my time is, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, I do have evening reflections where I review what I think I went well, what went better, and then plan out the rest of my day there. And then I will spend time meditating in the morning, and I think that's quite important. I like to organize my time in terms of 50-minute increments or so of very focused work, not allow myself to look at social media, but just pay attention to the task at hand for whatever that increment is, usually about 50 minutes. And then for about 10 or 5 minutes, I'll take a short break. And I think that's quite useful. If you're really excited about productivity and different routines, you can check out a group called Ultimate Working, I believe. And they have this technique called work cycles that I think is quite useful. And one thing that you do when you do one of these sessions where you sit down and say, I'm just going to work for 15 minutes or 10 minutes is beforehand, you want to set a clear purpose, set a clear intention for what you'd like to do at that time. And I think that idea of before you do an activity, setting a purpose is very important to me and something that I've also included in Stoic meditations and Stoa itself. It's part of the meditation practice. Is before you meditate, engage in purpose setting, decide what you would like out of the session, and in particular ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why is it valuable to me? And once you do that, you can clarify, whether you're spending time the way you want to, and also remind yourself, why you're doing the things that you're doing, and follow through. So I'll do that. Organize my work days that way. Meditate in the morning, reflect in the evening, spend some time resting in the evening as well. And then I think I would also be remiss if I didn't include two other bits, which both quite well known, not at all unique, but important, which is that I think reading is a pretty important part of my routine, and it's not something I do specifically at a particular time, but something I try to bring into whenever I have free time or between meetings, that sort of thing. It's something you can do very quickly if you have a Kindle or a book nearby. And then I think that exercise cannot be overrated. I've sometimes forgotten that many of the ancient Greek philosophers were also pretty exceptional physically. Like Plato was a wrestler. I think that's probably not a coincidence. And it is probably both intrinsically and extrinsically worthwhile to exercise.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate the insights. Thank you so much for stopping by today to talk. And then where can people find you if they want to learn more about Stoa or about your personal journey?
Yeah, thanks so much, Liam. So you can go to stoameditation.com if you'd like to check out Stoa. It's also available for download on the Play Store and App Store. And if you'd like to follow Stoa or myself, you can do so on Twitter. Just search my name and I should arrive, or search Stoa Meditation and you'll see the Stoa accounts. Then finally, I'll mention that Stoa is also on Facebook, and you can join the Stoic meditation group and ask questions, talk to other people who are interested in Stoicism and meditation there.
Awesome. Well, Caleb, thank you very much for stopping by today, and look forward to talking again soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Liam. This is great.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for stopping by today. If you enjoyed what you heard, please stop by Spotify or iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts from. Give us a 5-star review. I would love to hear more about what you enjoy, so connect with me on Twitter @LiamDAubry. Thank you all so much, and remember, seize the day.